In this video lesson, we'll discuss the legacy of the Civil War. With the end of the war, the changes will affect the economy, the social structure of both the North and South, the labor market, politics, and technology. The political changes have to do with the government. And the federal government assumes control over the seceded states, and no state has ever seceded again. The war increased the power of the federal government and increased the power of the president. The war actually increased the power of the federal government in these ways, and Lincoln invoked some of these things as war powers as well. The first income tax was created, where the income, the money that people are paid for working, was actually taxed to be able to pay for the war. Abraham Lincoln suspended the right of habeas corpus, which means that he could hold someone that he felt was a danger to the Union indefinitely, and that is a presidential war power. We will get a regulated currency and more of a paper currency than the United States had in the past, and it will be more consistent throughout the country. And the conscription requirement will actually become part of the United States society or political arena. Basically, conscription, remember, that is the formal name for the draft. The federal government will also undertake additional responsibilities for subsidizing railroads. The National Bank Act in 1863 will be passed, which chartered banks, set requirements for loans, and required banks to be inspected. All of these are economic changes. Some other economic changes would be that conscription caused a labor shortage in the North, which was filled by machines during the Civil War. So now, soldiers and people that are returning to work after coming home from fighting the war are going to find that the jobs that they had previously are taken by machines. Northern industries had to refocus to compete in a peacetime economy, and so there will be changes that will in turn affect the economy. The South is going to completely lose its labor force and its trading partners, since Great Britain and France had gone elsewhere for their cotton, and the labor force, which was the slaves, would now be freed. Since most of the fighting took place in the South, the land was completely destroyed, livestock was wiped out, and their railroads had also been destroyed, in large part to prevent them from having an effective transportation network. All of these are going to affect the economy. The economic gap between the North and South was much wider than it was before the war began. In 1860, the South controlled 30% of the nation's wealth. In 1870, the South controlled only 12% of the nation's wealth, which is a tremendous drop. So, economic costs. The Union war costs totaled $2.3 billion. Confederate war costs ran to $1 billion. Union war costs increased the national debt from $65 million in 1860 to $2.7 billion in 1865. Confederate debt ran over $1.8 billion in 1864. Union inflation peaked at 182% in 1864. And Confederate inflation rose to 7,000%. No part of society was left untouched. You can see here that the total strength of the armies are shown here in these numbers. The death rate is shown here. The Union death rate was 23%. The Confederate death rate was 24%. The amount that were non-mortally wounded, which means they survived their injuries, 275,000 Union, and over 100,000 Confederate. Soldiers that died from their wounds, over 110,000 Union, and over 94,000 Confederate. The number that died from disease, and you can clearly see that the majority of the soldiers died from disease or infection, over 249,000 for the Union and 164,000 for the Confederacy. Societal changes are now that slavery is over and the slaves have been freed. Congress will pass the 13th Amendment, which will outlaw slavery. Matthew Brady, who's the photographer who has taken a lot of the pictures that you've seen in these videos, chronicled the war with hundreds of photos, and he began photojournalism. Jefferson Davis was arrested, tried, and found not guilty, and he lived to be an old man. Robert E. Lee lost his family home when Montgomery Meigs turned it into Arlington National Cemetery. So if you've ever been to Washington, to Arlington National Cemetery, that land was formerly owned by Robert E. Lee. Lee went on to become the president of Washington University, which is now Washington and Lee University. Clara Barton took her war experience and founded the American Red Cross, which continues to use the procedures from the battlefields of the Civil War today. And Ulysses S. Grant was elected president in 1868. Sadly, Lincoln will survive for a very, very short time after the Civil War ends, only a few days. Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd, went to Ford's Theater in Washington to see the play My American Cousin. A man named John Wilkes Booth shot him in the back of the head. He lived through the night, but died in the very early morning hours the next day. Lincoln's body was taken by train to his gravesite in Springfield, Illinois. Here you can see the funeral parade for him and the hearse which carried his body. John Wilkes Booth actually never survived to be tried. He was actually killed before then. But his conspirators were captured, and they actually survived until their trials, and they were hung by the neck until they were dead, which can be seen here in the picture. These are the actual co-conspirators that were convicted in the Lincoln assassination. Andrew Johnson will now become president now that Abraham Lincoln has been assassinated. This was the first time a vice president assumed the presidency because of a death. Johnson was sworn in as the country's 17th president, but unfortunately, Lincoln's plans for Reconstruction will die with him, and Johnson's plans for Reconstruction will wreak havoc in the North and the South. And we'll discuss that further and Lincoln's assassination in more detail in our lessons in class.